Welcome to Open BXRX Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. New York State recently created a first in the nation $2.1 billion fund to provide direct cash assistance to workers ineligible for state unemployment benefits or federal COVID related income relief. Joining us now to share more is Representative of Assembly District 72 and sponsor of the Excluded Workers Fund, Carmen De La Rosa. She's also the Democratic nominee for City Council District 10. Welcome and congrats, Assemblymember.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a pleasure having you. And we're discussing a very important topic. So, the Excluded Workers Fund. Can you tell us more about this historical fund?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you that the fund was created when we saw the sheer pain and need that existed in our community during the darkest hours of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the bread lines in our communities were around the corner and people were literally starving were it not for government intervention. We saw that many of our constituents that were in dire need were able to get access to government intervention like food and assistance to unemployment benefits. But as usual, there was a portion of the population that was left out. And that portion of the population were some of the most vulnerable. They were workers who were undocumented, workers who were not part of the traditional workforce. And those workers did not have access to neither the Trump stimulus checks that were coming in or unemployment or any other type of cash assistance in order to put food on the table. And so I got together with Senator Jessica Ramos from Queens, who serves a community that also, like our community, was at the center of the epicenter of COVID-19 deaths, and a bunch of hardworking community activists and advocates like Make the Road New York, New York's Communities for Change, and many others who formed a coalition in order for us to come together and draft legislation that would address this issue. And that's how the Fund for Excluded Workers was born.
Thank you for sharing that, Assembly member. So we know, in Queens, as you mentioned, and here in the Bronx, we have so many street vendors and delivery workers, all of these essential workers who were kind of ignored during the pandemic. Can you share who exactly would be considered an excluded worker?
Absolutely. Literally, it's everyone who was delivering your food, anyone who was maybe taking care of children. We saw a lot of domestic workers. Street vendors were certainly hard hit. Anyone who was basically in the service industry, mostly, as I said, undocumented people or underdocumented people that maybe were in the process of legalizing their status, but were not quite there. And so these were the people that were mostly impacted. When you think about hotel workers, when you think about restaurant workers, there's always that person, the barback, the dishwasher, the people that are invisible to those with privilege. That are often left out of the decision-making table and are often left out of the benefits that we have the privilege to enjoy every single day. Those were the people that we were trying to help.
So now this fund is here to help them. What exactly is the eligibility for the funds and what documents are needed to apply?
Yeah, so I'm going to list them out because there's a lot for the eligibility. So basically, there's 2 points of eligibility. It's residency requirement. So you have to be a resident of New York and you have to have resided in New York prior to March 27, 2020, when things shut down for the pandemic. You have lost your wages or income after February 2020 because of COVID. Either you were unemployed or partially employed, or there was a COVID-related death or disability of the main breadwinner in your household. You were not eligible for unemployment insurance or any federal relief. And you have not earned more than $26,208 in the 12 months before the law came in effect. And so there's 2 tiers. There's a 2-tier system. And within that 2-tier system, there's also proof of residency. So you need documents like a non-expired driver's license or a non-driver ID or an ID NYC. There's also information to prove that you lived in New York, like a utility bill, a bank or credit card statement, a current lease or mortgage payment, a property tax statement. You should be able to prove your identity through things like a non-expired passport issued by a foreign country or the United States. You could also have things like a marriage certificate, and other, it's a point system. So it's like kind of like when you go into the DNV, there's certain documents that have more points than others. One of the main documentations that will give you access to the first tier of the program is an ITIN number, which many people who are undocumented, they apply for the ITIN numbers through the IRS because they do pay taxes, although some people think that that is a fallacy. Many of these people do pay taxes, and they do that through an ITIN number. So you have filed your tax returns and you're able to prove that you've done that. You're eligible to for up to $15,600 in pre-tax benefits. So this was a deliberate number. We wanted to bring parity between what people who were on regular unemployment received and these workers, because at the core of this project is the ability to bring parity and equity into the funds that were coming in. So a person that receives about $300 a week from unemployment insurance, over 52 weeks, the total comes out to about 15,600. Now, if you're not eligible for the tier one, there's a smaller tier two, which is $3,200 of total benefits pre-tax. And that's the sum of three federal stimulus checks. And it's a one-time payment. And, it's not what we wanted. We were fighting for much, much more. But this was what we were able to do under the restraints of a very difficult budget negotiation
Right.
during the budget negotiations in Albany.
Oh, I definitely wanted to talk about that. So I know that obtaining these funds didn't come without any challenges, right? Assembly member, can you share some of those obstacles you and other legislators had to overcome to get here?
Absolutely. Let me talk a little bit about the history and the organizing that went into actually making the fund come to a point where it hit the mainstream and people were talking about it. We had to build political pressure, not only in within the institutions that we serve, but also outside of the institutions that we serve, as I like to call it, people power. So we began to organize around the Fund for Excluded Worker a year before the budget negotiations began. And that first started by doing actions, rallies, teach-ins, sit-ins, hunger strikes. At the height of budget negotiations, there were workers who went on a 23-day hunger strike in order to prove the urgency of this fund. And so, we slept outside of Jeff Bezos' apartment. I joined the workers in sleeping on a sidewalk in New York City in front of the most expensive building in here in the city, just to show that inequality that was happening. And then inside, we also had to make sure that we were forming coalitions of like-minded legislators that were going to help us push for this fund. The conversations got intense, right? Every time you talk about immigrant communities, there's always going to be a group of people that think that you're taking away from people who got here the right way to give to people who didn't. And that is absolutely false. These people are contributing to our communities. These people are serving our communities. And, in a dire moment in my family, we grew up that tú no le niegas un plato de comida a nadie. You don't deny
Así mismo.
anyone a plate of food. And
Yep.
that's what we were fighting for. That was the essence of this battle. And so we really had to battle some of those narratives that wanted to portray excluded workers as people that were trying to game a system. The insinuations that they would be scamming New York State was something that was deplorable and that came up consistently. These people are marginalized people who an interaction with the criminal justice system will cause them, literally their families, and the risk of deportation. No one's trying to get deported over $3,000 or $15,000. They make way more than that in a
Yeah.
year when they actually are able to work. And so we had to deal with those narratives. We were originally asking for $3.5 billion. We were able to get the fund at $2.1 billion. Every time you negotiate, there's going to be concessions, right? It was a tough economic year where we were trying to fund things like fully funding education, and funding other parts of the budget that would include access to healthcare for many of these communities. And so unfortunately, in any negotiation, you're pitting needed communities against one another, and you end up having to concede a little. So 2.1 is still a huge success, because in other states like California, it was $1 million fund, a $2 million fund, $25 million fund. It was a drop in the bucket. This is the most substantial program we have across the nation, and that's why it's so historic.
Yes, it's historic indeed. So I want to know next steps, Assembly Member. Undocumented workers have long asked for pathways to citizenships. Is this a possible next step? After this EWF fund came out.
Look, I think that the fight for a pathway to citizenship is always at the forefront of every fight for immigrant justice. And these fights for equity in the financial structures that exist in our city and in our state are an adjacent battle to that fight.
Hmm.
Because obviously, when people don't have the documentation they need to fully participate in society, financially, right, they're always going to be excluded. The only way to have full inclusion is to include everyone and to give them that pathway to citizenship. We know that in the federal government, now we have a Democratic House, we have a Democratic president. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with my colleagues at the federal level to build that political pressure, right? As I mentioned, every fight, you need that political pressure. I think the Dreamers, our documented youth, have led the way. They have really blazed that trail for us to do the right thing. And now we need, President Biden, we need Congress, we need the US Senate to do the right thing by them. So I'm going to keep fighting for them and with them, in order for us to make sure that we get there.
Yes, we know you continue being a fierce advocate for immigrant rights, and you've stood beside the documented workers who fought for this for so long. So before we go, Assembly Member, how can people find out more and apply for the Excluded Workers Fund and stay in touch with your office as well?
Absolutely. So part of the fund is that nonprofit organizations in our communities are going to be tasked with administrating these funds and helping out. So there is a list of nonprofit organizations in all of our communities that are equipped and have the capacity to help you fill out the application. I want to make this disclaimer very clear. You do not have to pay to have the application filled out. If someone asks you for a monetary contribution to fill out the application, get your documents and walk out of that office, because they should not be doing that. And we have to be very careful because this is a vulnerable population that often is the victim of scams. So you can go to the Department of Labor website, and there you will see how the application, what documents are needed, the eligibility requirements as well. Yeah, see the link below, as well as the fundforexcludedworkers.org, which is a website that was put up by the Coalition for the Fund for Excluded Workers. And there's a lot of insight tips on how to get ready, how to prepare. You do need to have these documents in order. So before you start the application, we're asking folks to take a minute and read the materials and, reach out to our offices. You can follow me on Instagram at CN De La Rosa. I often put updates there. And also my office is in Upper Manhattan at 210 Sherman Avenue. So please come reach out to your elected representatives, get involved, and let's make sure that we do this right.
Muchas gracias, Assembly Member De La Rosa. Thank you for joining us today.
El placer es mío. Thank you for having me.
Cuídate. We're taking a quick break on Open BXRX Tuesday. We'll be right back.